First of all, I just want to say,
Okay.
I just want to say thank you.
Well, my pleasure.
First of
My
all.
pleasure being here. It's the first
Not
time
just for
I've
being
met
here,
Danielle.
not just for being here, but for all that
the
you
other
did.
stuff.
Exactly.
All
Yes,
right.
all the other stuff.
I love it.
Thank you.
Very cool.
So,
Switch it
the
on.
microphone.
You didn't tell me about that.
Exactly. There's always some tricks.
It's not my fault.
So I'd like to take you back to the time between 1954 and 1957.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Ready? Because, so you'll all know, I think probably lots of you already know the story of the integration of Central High in Little Rock. The Supreme Court in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, declares de jure segregation unconstitutional. And at that point, planning gets underway, and Little Rock, the city, actually is proactive. It wants to integrate. The state of Arkansas is a different matter, but leadership in Little Rock is ready to start planning, and they develop, in 1955, I believe, they develop a plan for integration that will launch in September of 1957. And the NAACP, Daisy Bates, is working closely with leadership in Little Rock, and one of the first things they have to do is find young people willing to take this chance.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about why you said yes? In other words, this is,
Yeah, well, certainly.
why did it matter to you?
I think a better question would be, why would I have even considered no? I had lived in Little Rock since birth. I had the distinct misfortune of popping out of the womb in Little Rock in 1941. Now, if you know anything about that era, and you do, of course, it was really an unpleasant time, to put it very mildly. The law said I didn't count for much. The law said I didn't really matter. And that was the way it was, which really was confusing to me because it made absolutely no sense. Yet I had to figure out how to survive in that environment. And for the first 13 years of my life, we were, as a nation, operating under the aegis of the Plessy decision, the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which declared that we, the people, should conduct our affairs in relation to each other based on racial group membership. And that was profoundly disturbing to me as a young kid. And I can't underestimate how important that was. I wanted some balance. Well, one of the first things I wanted was to be out of Little Rock. But then once I got out of Little Rock, I found out this is ridiculous because wherever I went, it was the same thing. I mean, any place south of Canada was the South. Now, that was a huge dilemma. And so when the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown case, I was literally ecstatic because now the law is on my side, first time ever. So I raised my hand very quickly when the question was put, would you join us? And we had about probably 150 volunteers. Those numbers dwindled down very quickly once we explained to our parents what we'd done at school that day.
So talk about that part. I want to get these two pieces together. So you knew with every fiber of your being that the laws that had existed were wrong. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
You were ready to help put your energies behind making a new world out of the old one, given the legal change. But parents didn't want their kids to do that. What were the parents' concerns?
Well, majority of parents were just afraid for the lives of their children.
Yeah.
I mean, the rumors were, and the reality was, we could have been killed. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew that. So my main fear was, how am I going to stay alive? Although, at 15, you have a sense of immortality. Well, you've been young people, and you death defied your life at those times. Nothing can harm you, right? So we had that going for us. But even so, we were aware at all times that this was very tenuous. We could be taken out on any given day. So that parents were more than skittish. They just said, absolutely not. Are you kidding me? No, you're not killing my child. Which is a deterrent even now. You talk about change. A lot of parents, especially, won't. I would imagine even at Parkland there were some parents who said, no, you're not getting involved because who knows what will happen.
So let's talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind. Parents had this. I totally get the parents who said, ixnay. Ixnay. You know, my job, I brought you into this world, I'm keeping you in this world, and maybe
Temporarily.
well, there you go, exactly. You know, so for the families, you know, that were able to say, okay, we're gonna share everything here. We're gonna take a risk that goes to a mortal risk. So that's sort of on question 2, right? Or sorry, question 2. Yeah, how much should I share? Right. The answer in your case was you were getting ready to share everything. But I would love to hear a little bit more about the conversation inside your family, as versus the conversation you heard with friends who decided not to make that choice. What do you think made it possible for you to make that really huge choice about how much to share of yourself?
Well, I think first thing was when I reported to my parents, decided to do this, they immediately responded by saying, "We will support your decision 100%." Highly unusual for parents. And then they followed up by saying, if you get up there and you find you need to quit, we'll support your decision to quit 100%.
There you go.
Now that was an amazing thing. I don't think I completely realized it initially. But later on, I understood that I had the best of all worlds because I could stay there or leave without fear of losing their esteem. That was an amazing point.
So that's really interesting, actually, because it means the choice you made was kind of nuanced. It wasn't I'm ready to share everything, absolutely, no holds barred, no backing off from it. It was, I'm going to feel my way through this thing. I'm ready to share. I think I'm ready to share as much as it's possible to share, but I'm going to walk my way through this, making judgments about that, and my parents are going to support me in that.
Exactly.
Right.
Which I think most kids need that, because you need that leeway to figure out who you are and what's going on. And if you ally yourself with some principled action and you find that it's not going to work, then what? Then you got all kind of psychological disturbances to deal with along the way.
And so can you say a little bit about those early days, September 4th, when, you know, gosh, all those folks descended on Little Rock from other parts of the state, and Governor Falbus sent the National Guard out there. So you must have been feeling your way.
Oh, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about, you know...
Well, by the way, since you brought that up, just give me a chance to suggest that we all take a new look at the national narrative about that, because mostly it's wrong. But I know the national narrative says Elizabeth came first and then the other 8 of us came as a group. That part is definitely wrong. And it's not so bad because it's out there and you can't do anything about it. But just know that some of that stuff you read, you have to really investigate closely. So Elizabeth did come by herself.
Right, but you guys were already there.
No, I came up by myself from the other direction. And that is rarely reported. It is reported in some places. And I found Elizabeth there in a state of shock, sitting on that bus bench. I didn't see her at first because the mob was so thick. I was actually surrounded by a phalanx of reporters and photographers, news people wanting to get a scoop right on the scene. So I'm blankly answering questions. But they also prevented the mob from getting to me, which is why I prolonged the interview. Okay, another question, please. So then not the other 7, but a group of 7 other students came. But another missing fact is we were 10 strong that day. We were the Little Rock 10, very briefly. And Jane Hill, who was a 10th student, and if you Google carefully, you can find her. But do Jane Hill and insert Little Rock 9 too, otherwise you'll find somebody who sells bridal products. So, and then the other 7 entered as a group with ministers and so forth. But we all experienced the same thing. The guards were intractable. They would not let us through. Now, I was afraid, and that was the basic thing. The point of this whole story is to say that my fear level went off the chart right away. Because these folk, what shocked me was not so much the opposition. Oh, yeah, you couldn't live in Little Rock as a black person and not expect opposition at that point. But the intensity. And the intensity was magnified by the fact that you had grandparents out there holding their grandkids' hands. And I immediately saw that, and even at age 15, I could see something going on there that was terrible for this entire country, because if you've got that kind of transmission of thought and feeling and lore over how many numbers of people who do that sort of thing, we will constantly be in trouble, which probably accounts for the craziness we're in this year, 2018, in many ways. But at any rate, so there I am, fearful as all get out. I make several attempts to get through. I realize it's futile, so I began to walk home. And then this adult white man begins to chase me, and I look around, and I'm ready to fight. Although I know nothing about fighting. I've eschewed fighting because once I figured out that if you fight, you might get hurt. Didn't want any part of it. So, but I assumed a stance. And he said, oh, no.
That's true, you don't know how to fight.
I'm your friend, exactly. He said, I'm not an enemy, I'm your friend. So at that moment, I recorded something else. Not every single white person in Little Rock wanted to kill me. Not every single one, which was good. I didn't have the exact count, but at least there was one. So I went home, and now we're in a state of limbo. So that lasts for about 3 weeks until we finally make another attempt to get into school, which was really crazy because by that time, Eisenhower, as president, had convinced the governor to comply a little bit. He allowed Eisenhower to federalize the Arkansas State National Guard. And that may not be the correct wording, he allowed. I don't think he really allowed anything. I think Eisenhower just did it. Okay, scratch that first note. And they were removed. Now, who's going to protect us? The decision was that the Little Rock police would do the job, right? Now, if you know anything about the relationship between white Southern policemen and black people, you will wonder about our sanity. But we agreed, and that was a disaster. The mob quickly overran the police lines, and there was some talk about letting the crowd hang one of us, and they would save 8, sort of 8-to-1, quid pro quo, well, not quite. So, but Gene Smith, who was the assistant police chief, stepped in and said, no, we're saving all of them, which, by the way, caused him such problems. He killed himself a few years later based on all the flack he got. But we got out. Now, we knew we couldn't do that again. So then the third time, the successful time, we had the U.S. Army, 101st Airborne Division. So I was a pretty happy camper at that point because I figured that from this point on, if something goes bad, I'll jump behind the soldiers and they will begin to mow people down. I'll take them out on my behalf. That was really satisfying, even though I'm nonviolent. Well, let me alter that. I'm 99.9% nonviolent. Right. Okay, I'm not completely nonviolent.
Self-defense.
Right. Yeah. So I will kill in self-defense.
Right. Yeah. So you said a lot of really important things in sharing that. Thank you for sharing it. And I'm going to go to a detail that will seem small, but you said you saw the grandparents and the grandchildren, and you knew, seeing that, that it was terrible for the whole country. I just want to register that as you had so many reasons that what you were doing was not just about yourself, right? That you weren't just thinking about you were thinking about we. But it's amazing that you were thinking about the whole country. You weren't just thinking about what's good for black people. You were actually thinking about, I can see what's happening to this white kid. And this is bad, this is terrible for the whole country, you thought to yourself. Can you say more about that? How you thought about the whole country?
That's interesting. I hadn't really parsed it out quite so carefully, but looking back, my mom, wonderful woman, had great insight, and she taught all 7 of us, there were 7 kids in the family, that we were on the planet, but we were not individuals. We were not alone. We shared this space with everybody else. And what happened to one had an impact on the other. She didn't hammer the point, but she made the point, and she lived that. In her, so you saw it daily. She was concerned about all of us. She had her own catering business. So in microcosm, I got to see her interact. She interacted with people along a wide continuum. Some people really didn't like black people, but they liked her cooking. And so they would hire us. And as a young kid, I remember just watching her deal with that. And it didn't seem to faze her. She would not ever look up to anybody or look down on anybody. It was always pure relationships. And she was concerned about who was benefiting and who wasn't. She was one of these people who would collect stray people. I'd come home from school someday and have to step over people sleeping off drunks. There would be people weeping in the corner. I mean, it was just kind of, that was the way life was. Her concern about others really impacted me. And I understood. Oh, she also said to all of us, there's no such thing as race. So I learned early on the mythology of that stuff. And it was, I didn't realize it at the time, but so valuable growing up. Because I never got caught up in the group stuff, you know, my group, your group. Because I understood the only thing that made us different was our ancestry, not race. Race has no basis in fact. But ancestry is very real, because all those millions of people who copulate furiously over the centuries finally result in us. Boom, there they are. And that made so much sense to me. So I always looked at things that way, globally. And I especially looked at it in terms of the younger people, the little people, because they generally have no resource. They have nothing to defend themselves against parents whose ideology is so screwed up.
So that's a really powerful story, and so that it's what it suggests to me is that you're saying that the sort of thinking that I'm trying to describe as the movement from I to we was just really baked into you from a very early age by
Quite
your
so.
mother's own orientation towards shared humankind
Right.
and a kind of equality among human beings. And was that something that, as you did make the decision to participate in the integration, was that something that you explicitly talked about? Or was it really mainly a lesson from example by your mother?
More example. We had some talks, yes, but not ever anything in depth. She simply modeled. That was my term for it. She modeled behavior.
Right.
She modeled interaction. She modeled how to respond to others. My mom was a hugger. If you got within hugging distance, you were hugged. And it didn't matter who you were.
Right.
Didn't matter who you were, what you
Right.
smelled like.
Right.
Okay. She would grab you.
Right.
It's, I'm leaning in that direction, but I'm not quite there. But the thing was, all 7 of us kids benefited from this. And that too was something that stood out for me. Because, each individual in the universe can choose where he or she's going to go. But, when you look at the life pathway of all of my siblings, it's all pretty much along the same way. Little differences, in terms of our uniqueness, but basically, we love people. We are totally in love with ourselves. Which, by the way, is so important.
Yeah,
you have to start off. You have to start off. You
the
can't love others
self-protection, exactly.
if you don't love
That's
yourself.
right.
There's no way on
Exactly.
earth that's going to happen.
That's right.
But the other thing I think is probably very important. My mom read voraciously. She realized she needed to know, and so she never stopped reading throughout her life. In fact, once we moved from Little Rock to Los Angeles, she didn't continue with the catering business. She went back to school.
Right. Okay.
And here's a woman who's already given birth to 7 kids, and she's finally going back to school.
Right.
And she got into, she became a vocational nurse.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's exciting. So I want to come back to one other moment in your description of that first day, and that is, you said you were leaving the crowd finally. The interview had run out. You'd used up all your questions. You couldn't get any more safety out of that, and you were trying to get away. Somebody came after you. You were ready to fight, and they said, "I'm not an enemy. I'm a friend."
Right.
And you added one person to your count of white people in Little Rock who didn't want to kill you. So can you say more about that interaction? How did your conversation with him proceed? And then how did you think about the different allies who were participating, the adults, the ministers, on the one hand, Daisy Bates, representative from the NAACP, on the other hand? What was their role for you in this?
Wow, yeah. It turned out that you could put people along this continuum in terms of their support for us. And you could not color code it. It didn't matter if you were so-called white or so-called black. There were black people in Little Rock who were very angry with us because we were upsetting things and making it impossible for them to have the life they thought they were leading. But Daisy Bates, her husband, L.C. Bates, Thurgood Marshall, and Wiley Branton, who were our attorneys, people like that, were stalwart supporters, absolutely. We had people we could rely upon to think straight and think their way through all these legal hurdles, and also just offer tidbits of advice to us in terms of what might happen at Central. We didn't really have training. Sometimes you see what happened with the civil rights workers in Alabama and Mississippi. They went through training programs. We didn't have anything like that. In fact, I think there was some concern about what was going to happen in Little Rock, but not enough.
That's right.
Nobody knew.
How bad.
A lot of people were thinking we're part of the Upper South,
right,
as if they could take glory in that. It was absolutely insane. But everybody discovered almost at the same instance of how intense this opposition was. And when you start pushing against that racist ideology, you get a lot of pushback very quickly.
So I want to come back to that point in a second, but before I do, just still on the subject of allies and their roles, what they did, do you have any memories of the group of you, 10 and then 9, asking for help from adults? That is, were there things adults forgot to think about that you had to ask for help on?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I can't remember any instance of asking for help. Might have been a good idea
So the adults did a,
in retrospect.
but so from your, the adults did a reasonably good
They did
job
a reasonably
of
good job.
covering the things
because,
that you needed. The
Daisy
legal-
Bates helped tremendously. She did a lot of coordinating with the military. We would group together at her home in the mornings. We would get into Army vehicles. Then we would have a convoy up to the school with lights and sirens. And then we'd disembark and soldiers would take us into school. That was all set up and planned by the adults. We didn't have to ask for it. We had our own individual soldier, not the same one every day, but we had individual soldiers, and we could talk to them and they could adjust based on what we both saw. For instance, I might spy the ambush, or the soldier might spy the ambush, either one of us, but we'd inform the other.
Right.
And we'd change our route, that sort of stuff.
Wow.
So there was a lot of coordination. But the kids at Central were very devious, and they would sometimes outthink us, and we wind up getting hurt as a consequence.
Can you give an example?
Well, these tactics, I call them hit and run. So if I'm walking down the hallway with my soldier, he's right at my side. Some kid might run up behind me and shove me downstairs or whack me with a bat and then run, the hit and run. Now the soldier would be charged with the responsibility of either staying there to protect me or going after this guy. And I would always vote for option one, do not leave, because it could have been a ploy to direct him away and then leave me vulnerable to those who are hiding in the shadows. That sort of thing. You know, one time somebody asked me, did you really learn anything at Central that year? So of course, how to survive in a hostile environment.
Right.
Survival 101.
Right.
And actually, it's quite true, but it was good. It was useful for me because I learned not only to survive, but how to master my own fear. And that was an incredible thing.
So survival 101, first lesson, master your own fear.
Right.
Can you expand on that lesson now? We're moving into how you handle the downside of crowds, which is a very innocuous way of describing, obviously, the magnitude of the resistance here. But so mastering your fear, how?
At some point, I realized that other people do not make me afraid. I chose fear in response to what I saw. And I saw this murderous mob, and I responded with fear. Now, I had other options. I didn't realize it at the time. By the time that thought hit me, this was sometime during the year, I thought, wow, I need to do something about that. So I began to work toward mastering the fear. I didn't do a really good job of it. And I don't think any human can do the best job possible, but we can lean in that direction. And we can take charge of that fear, and we reduce its impact. That was readily apparent, because before that, I was a wreck, you know, physically, psychologically, physiologically even. I mean, it was a real mess. But now, I tell students, fear does not have to interfere with goal-directed behavior. And that was the other thing. Once you reduce that fear to a level you could tolerate, then you could focus on the academics. Because in spite of all this other stuff, it wasn't the primary thing, but there was a secondary goal to learn what they were, quote, teaching us. Yeah, whatever that was.
All right. So lesson number 2 in survival number 101. The first one was master your fear. What was the second lesson?
Be alert. Be alert to what's around you, because stuff happens very quickly. You know, can be on top of you. You're talking about crowds.
Yeah.
I read Reinhold Niebuhr's work, Moral Man, Immoral Society. And he talks in there, I think his main thesis really, is that crowds of people are basically immoral. And they can do anything.
Right.
Because there's no conscious involvement that this is me making a choice. I'm just with the group.
Right.
That might be subsumed under groupthink, you know, as a rubric heading. But once you master the fear and then you're really alert to what's going on, then you can begin to plan your choices of action. What are you going to do? And you need some calm presence of mind to make plans. And by the way, you can do this. Okay? You just don't have to run in panic and fear. And sometimes you see people, there's a shooter, there's a known shooter, and you see the news reports and people going, ah, and they're just all over the place. That stuff will get you killed. You need a plan. You need to figure out, and maybe you think you don't have time, but you do. Even if you have a few seconds, you have time to think about, how am I going to save myself? And maintain some cerebral process. Don't give in to the limbic system, because that stuff will take you places you don't want to go.
So that's a really hard thing. So if you were thinking about, I mean, you had to learn by force of necessity.
Right.
You were just learning because you had to survive, and you were equipped resources of love and example from your parents and your own thinking capacities to find your way to the path to survival. But if you were trying to help a young person now learn that kind of psychological self-control that gives them a chance to always bring even reflection in, even to moments of stress, what kind of lessons would you try to develop to support them?
You know, what I say to young people, and we do talk a lot about this, self is the basic tool that you have. That's the basic tool. It's like with any tool, you got to know as much as you can about how it operates, what it requires, what nurtures this tool, what gives it energy. And then you also understand that building the self is inside out work, not outside in. You don't go looking for things to tack on. You find in here what you need, and you build that, and you play that off what's out there, and then you readjust. But all that work is going on inside. So a lot of self-development is thinking through, who am I? What am I here for? Why am I on this planet? What is my purpose? That sort of stuff, that kind of work. In fact, I think it was, I think I read this in some of Dr. King's writings. He was talking about doing the civil rights work. You have to really do soul searching to determine if your motives are pure. Are my motives truly pure?
Back to the first question, right?
Yeah, right. Why does it matter to me? Exactly. And if that is something that you can really wrap your head around, things begin to make more sense. You know, you can be much more calm and at peace throughout life if you just answer that first question.
Is that what you meant by goal-directed action,
Yes.
even in context of adversity?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay.
So you don't lose sight of that. You don't lose sight of that. If you know that you are a person of worth, and if you know that you have value, see, a lot of people don't. They simply wrestle with that notion. A lot of high school kids, you know where I've seen the most panic? In cafeterias. There's a kid at the end of the line with a tray. Where am I going to sit? Okay.
Right.
That is sheer panic. Doesn't have to be. It could go something like this. I'm hungry, I have lunch, I'll sit at the available seat. How many kids do that? Some, yeah, but not a lot, not a lot.
Right.
We leave it up to others. See, there's this concept called peer pressure. Probably heard about that. Did you ever have peer pressure?
I had peer pressure.
See,
I had
here's
peer
the deal.
pressure.
Here's the difference between you and me. I learned early on that that was a myth.
Ah, okay, there you go. Very good.
Yeah, because my mom said it's not peer pressure. If you follow what other people do, that's just stupid. Okay. She's very direct, right? So we were inoculated against peer pressure, and a wonderful
good.
thing.
Right.
So you had kids, inoculate them against peer pressure. Tell them the truth. There's no such animal.
Right.
It's
Gotcha.
about choice making. You make your own choice. If 10,000 of your peers turn left, but you deem that to be destructive or potentially so, by all means choose to go right and feel good about it. Okay.
So the negative aspects of crowds are just, you know, powerfully present in the Little Rock Show.
Yes.
There's no way not to see that first. So I want to see if we can see a harder thing. Were there any good things that came out of the crowds in Little Rock?
Yes. Now you have to now have the skill to note that with any crowd, there is never, ever unanimity of thought. Never. So there's some people in there, you just have to identify them. Now, how do you do that? Sometimes you see signs on their face. Sometimes you'll see it in their eyes, and their compassion just emanates from that. They're there, but you have to be, and you can only do that if you have developed a calmness and steadiness about yourself, and you know where your goal is. I'm looking for somebody who's an ally here, who can help me, and then you do that. Now, I didn't have those skills early on. They've developed over time. And that's another thing. Don't chastise yourself if you don't have all these skills at the ready. But you can always learn. That's who we are. We're learners. Lifelong learners, by the way.
Over the course of that year in Central High, would you say, were you able to acquire some of that
Oh, yes.
skill? Can you,
Absolutely.
any examples come to mind of where you felt yourself being able to say, I can do this now, I can make a connection with this person that I couldn't
Well,
do that
in
earlier?
conjunction with the fear level diminishing, I was much calmer in the face of the impending danger, rather than just panic. I would think, okay, how can I help to de-escalate the situation? What can I do? And I didn't know it at the time, but I've since come to understand what I was doing was something I've read about recently, and that is thinking for two people. Thinking for me, thinking for that person.
I just want a little quick timeout, right? So it was master fear, be alert, and now we've added de-escalate the situation and think for two.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Anyway, but can you say more about, you realized you were thinking for two. Can you give us any examples of that kind of de-escalation or ways that you learned how to do that year?
Making eye contact with your attacker or your potential attacker. And we had taken the vow of nonviolence, so we had already decided not to fight back. So what you do is you stand there and you project your humanity. And what you're asking for is, I want to meet your humanity. Can we come together? Non-verbally, this is going on. And there were instances where I could perceive, because either the person wouldn't hit me at all or would just hit me a few times and leave. And so I knew, okay, there was this...
That was a person who we can bring over to the good.
Exactly, at some point.
Right.
If I could absorb more blows. But you know, it's costly. In fact, I say this to middle schoolers and they think I'm crazy. They go, it's not going to happen. Not going to put myself in that situation. But nonviolence actually makes sense when you think about it. I was listening to news just this morning before I came here about the situation in Syria and some of the bellicose statements from our leaders, and not just the president, but also Congress people who are ready to wage war. And I'm thinking they still haven't gotten it after centuries of human existence. War doesn't work, and yet we're still talking about it. And you know what they were saying? We want to rule out the use of chemical weapons. We'll still keep bullets. You can't kill people this way, but here's how you can kill them. And I'm thinking, well, what kind of logic is that? They're all going to be dead. But that's another story. There are probably people in this room who are warmongers. So I don't know. We may have to talk afterwards.
So speaking, you mentioned Dr. King earlier, and so your invocation of nonviolence makes me want to add some of his language. So he also described nonviolence as dangerous unselfishness, which is sort of what you just described, right? Not fighting back, dangerous unselfishness. But it's interesting, I think, to try to extend the principle into other contexts. So for example, I'll just share one story of my own, which is a related story at a completely different level. But so I'm a person who gets a lot of negative incoming email and tweets and stuff like that. A little less these days, actually. Whoa. I managed to get my head underneath the parapet. But I've had my massive kind of volleys of negative incoming stuff. And I've made it a practice of always responding in what you call like a verbally nonviolent way, right? It's like verbal nonviolence, principle of nonviolence. I'm like, thanks for writing. And this is an interesting point. I may disagree with this other point. Well, anyhow, just send it back. And what's the ratio of types of response? I mean, the responses I get back are a very small percentage, like maybe 5%, come back again with an equally nasty thing.
Really?
It's a teeny percentage.
Right.
And then there's, that's the people who hit you some and then they go, right? And then a chunk who don't respond at all, right? That's fine. And then a surprising chunk, like almost a third, who will come back and say, I hadn't thought of that. I'm like, what the heck? Like you directed the nastiest stuff I have ever heard at me, and then I say a little tiny thing. I never thought of that. It's shocking, but it's true. And so there's a funny way in which there has been a sort of escalation of our verbal environment, which is surprisingly easier to de-escalate than you might think. And I think we probably all need to give a little thought to that. And I do wonder if we could kind of take this principle of nonviolence and sort of pull it into the verbal realm and see if we can make progress with it.
I think we should really pursue that, because what I was just thinking about, most parents teach their kids, if another kid hits you, hit them back. I mean, when you poll people, you'll probably get that. Just hit them back. My wife and I decided, no, that's not what we're telling our daughters. We have 2 daughters. We said, never hit back. If a child hits you, appeal to the adult authority in the room.
Right.
Made more sense, see?
Right.
Because you're de-escalating the violence. You're trying to stamp it out. And yet, and here's a crazy story. My oldest child, 6 years old she was, first grade, kid hit her. She went to the teacher, and you know what the teacher said?
Hit her back.
Hit her back, yes. Which meant that I had to go from mild-mannered, nonviolent person to homicidal maniac, ready to kill the teacher.
Yeah.
Honestly, that just shocked me. But you're right. If we did more of that. I think about it too in terms of the hate mail I used to get. Bushels of hate mail. It came 24/6. Get the postman one day off. And my response to it always was, I need to correct the grammar and send it back. But no one would give it a return address.
Right.
So had it been on the internet, I could have replied, returned, but they wouldn't give their return address.
Yeah.
And I've recently just sent most of that to an archive, so some of you who do research will probably run into it. Some of it's really pretty cool.
Which archive is it in?
It's in the Butler Center Library System down in Little Rock, Arkansas.
All right, good to know. Okay.
But the thing is, if you think about it this way, everybody in the universe counts. My mom used to put it this way: everybody was somebody's baby. You know, it sounds trite even, but you respect that. Everybody was somebody's baby at one point. And you think about the innocence of infants. But somewhere along the way, they get corrupted. And that's tragic. It didn't mean that, they were evil from the start. No, I think some of this stuff is a part of the human growth process. And we all are responsible when you think about it, because we are, again, a committee of all of us.
Right.
We're on the same team, folk.
So on that note, that we're on the same team, let's thank Dr. Roberts, and then we'll open it up to questions. But let's start by thanking him for sharing
Well,
so
thank
much.
you. Thank you.